If the Nobel Peace Prize was given out to people who truly made the world a more peaceful place, one group would win every year: the United States military. The U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. Now you may be thinking, how can you award a peace prize to a group whose purpose is to fight wars? Fair question. I'll tell you how. Because the reason we are free, the reason anyone on Earth today is free, is ultimately thanks to the U.S. military. They saved the free world from German domination in the First World War. They saved the free world from Japanese and German fascism in the Second World War. They saved the free world from communism in the Cold War. And they're saving it now. That might sound like an exaggeration, but only because they have protected us for so long. National security, the protection of citizens from an external foe, is not a given. Far from it. It's the product of the hard work of American military men and women who stand guard 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, every year. And they've been doing so for as long as any of us can remember. The First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, the Korean War, both Iraq wars, the Afghan War. These were all conflicts that the U.S. tried to avoid. But they were wars that the U.S. fought not only for itself, but for good, decent, and free people everywhere. Where the U.S. military was not ultimately victorious, the Vietnam War, 50 million people were deprived of freedom of speech, of assembly, of press, of travel, and of religion. As many as 2 million more were brutally imprisoned and murdered. The only reason South Korea isn't an open-air concentration camp like its northern neighbor is because America came to South Korea's defense nearly 70 years ago. To this day, we still have 30,000 troops stationed there to protect the free South from the unfree North. And it's not just the open conflicts the American military resolves. It's the not wars, all the conflicts that were never fought because our adversaries feared the consequences of American military involvement. Let's put it this way. The reason Iowa soybeans can be shipped from Seattle to Shanghai, or coffee from Colombia to Cleveland, is because the American military, specifically the Navy, stands guard over the world's shipping lanes. Block those lanes and the price of everything skyrockets, and international commerce grinds to a halt. Like it or not, the U.S. military has been and remains as close to a global sheriff as exists on planet Earth. On the beat, keeping the peace. Don't believe me? Ask yourself this very simple question. What if China disarmed? Or Iran? Or North Korea? Or Russia? Think the world would be a better or worse place? The question answers itself. Now imagine if America disarmed. Think China stays out of Taiwan or Hong Kong? Iran out of Israel? North Korea out of South Korea? Russia out of Eastern Europe? And those are just state actors. Islamists would quickly return, bolder and more vicious than ever. In short, new conflicts would spring up and old ones reignite all over the world. Freedom would be in retreat every single day. That's the dystopian future of a world without the U.S. military. And that's because across the globe for the last 100 years and more, the bad guys have been thwarted. Not only by the American military, of course, but in every major conflict, American military force has been decisive. That's why when you meet a veteran, someone who served in the armed forces, you should thank them. We have even set aside a special day for it, Veterans Day. Not Memorial Day, that's for those who lost their lives fighting for America and for freedom. Veterans Day is different. It's for all those who risked their lives so that we could keep ours. If that's not worthy of a thank you, what is? So this year, put out a flag, call a veteran, someone who honorably served in the U.S. military, maybe your dad or mom or uncle or family friend, and thank them. Let them know that you are in their debt. We have been in their debt for so long, it's easy to take what they did, what they risked, and what they sacrificed for granted. We shouldn't. Veterans Day is meant to remind us. This year, don't forget. I'm Pete Hegseth, U.S. Army Major for Prager University.
This video was made possible by a generous grant from Colorado Christian University. Find out more about them at prageru.com/ccu.
From when America's armed forces entered World War I in 1917 until today, the United States military has repeatedly made the difference between civilization and barbarism. It's no exaggeration to say that a militarily strong America is the one indispensable prerequisite for a peaceful and prosperous world. The witness of history, as well as our own common sense, bears testament to the fact that when America's armed forces are powerful, focused and feared, the globe is a better place than when she is weak, unprepared and vacillating. In the past century alone, there have been 4 great threats made to peace, democracy and freedom. Each of them have come from enemies that hate and fear what the United States stands for, as laid down in her Declaration of Independence, Constitution and Bill of Rights. 3 of these have come from differing mutations of fascism, and one from its totalitarian twin, communism. In each case, it has been the US military that has been a principal force protecting the free world from the tyranny these threats have sought to impose. The First World War sprung from Germany's bid for hegemony over Europe and was powered by a Prussian military machine that was proto-fascist in its outlooks, ambitions and assumptions. When the discovery of the infamous Zimmermann telegram revealed that Germany wanted to extend the war even into the American heartland, the Wilson administration sent hundreds of thousands of young American recruits, nicknamed doughboys, onto the battlefields of Europe and tipped the balance in the Allies' favour. 25 years later, the American armed forces were again fighting against the second mutation of fascist ideology as espoused by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. On battlefields as distant from America as tiny islands in the South Pacific, picturesque villages in Italy and desolate towns in northern Africa, as well as on the sea in the Atlantic and in the skies over Germany, the American armed forces made another invaluable contribution to victory. Yet the fight for freedom wasn't over. Almost as soon as World War II ended, a new threat arose, the red fascist version of totalitarianism, Soviet communism. It soon cast its shadow over Eastern Europe as well as parts of Africa, Asia and Latin America. American military might, deployed intelligently and globally, played the key role in neutralizing and then ultimately bankrupting that terrible menace to the free world. When victory in the Cold War in the late 1980s and early 1990s finally came under the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, it was because the US armed forces were kept strong enough to deal with the ceaseless probing and provocations of the Soviet Union over nearly half a century. Since 9/11, the world has been faced with yet another mutation of fascism, fundamentalist Islamist terrorism. Taking on many of the features of earlier fascist movements, hatred of democracy and Christianity, a fanatical anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism, and a desire for utter uniformity, the Islamist terror movement has caused death and destruction wherever it has appeared. The fascist bacillus has mutated yet again, but it is alive and well. And yet again, the traditional antidote to the American military has taken up the task. By taking on the forces of terror in full-scale wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the US made it clear that it would not permit fascism to triumph in our time, any more than earlier generations of Americans permitted it to in theirs. All this has come at great cost in lives and money. The cost of these precious lives, men and women fighting for others' freedom far from their own homes, can never be repaid. But the money, a defence budget that is by far the largest in the world, has been well spent. It has protected the honour, power and prestige of the USA, upon which the cause of freedom ultimately relies. When the United States armed forces are weak as they were before the Second World War, when America had only the 14th largest army in the world, the likes of Adolf Hitler are encouraged to make larger and larger demands. When US armed forces are strong, however, even a superpower like the Soviet Union has to acknowledge its own internal contradictions and inability to overawe the West. With China rearming massively and posing a growing threat to Western interests and values around the world, and the threat of Islamist fascism still upon us, it is well to learn the central lesson of the past half-century of human experience, which is that for her own sake, and that of those who love freedom everywhere, the United States must be militarily preeminent. I'm Andrew Roberts for Prager University.
Join Prager University. Subscribe
There were
to our YouTube channel.
36,525 days in the 20th century. Of these, none was more consequential than June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy in Nazi-occupied France. It did not end World War II, but without it the Nazi war machine would not and could not have been defeated. We of course know the good guys. America, England and its allies won, but in 1944 there was no certainty of success. In fact, there was just as much doubt as confidence. Winston Churchill's senior advisor, Field Marshal Brooke, wrote in his diary, "I am very uneasy about the whole operation. It may well be the most ghastly disaster of the whole war." Brooke's fears were entirely reasonable. First, there were tens of thousands of men and millions of tons of material and supplies that had to be moved 100 miles across one of the roughest bodies of water in the world, the English Channel, and it had to be kept secret. If the Germans knew where and when the Allies were landing, they could mass forces against them and turn the beaches of northern France into killing fields. To prevent this, the Allies took every possible precaution. Their air forces destroyed bridges, roads and railways that might be used by the Germans to rush troops to the invasion site. Everyone knew the attack was coming. The key was to keep the Germans guessing. Fake radio chatter was broadcast to suggest the beaches near Calais would be the landing point. Double agents leaked fake details of units forming in southeast England, and movie set designers built phony tanks, planes and ships to support the ruse of an army preparing to cross near Dover for the benefit of German reconnaissance pilots and spies. The Germans swallowed it all. But the Nazis were not the only enemy the Allied forces faced. Mother Nature was just as threatening. The 23,000 paratroopers and glider-borne infantry jumping into Normandy needed moderate winds to be effective. The 12,000 Allied aircraft needed clear skies. The invasion fleet of 6,000 vessels needed calm seas, and there had to be a low tide to expose Nazi obstacles and mines. When high winds and rain began pummeling the Channel, Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower postponed the invasion date of June 5th by 24 hours. That might not sound like a significant delay, but it was. All forces were concentrated and ready to go. All the plans, all the deceptions could be exposed at any moment. Then came a new forecast. The weather appeared to be breaking. There might be a 12-hour window of opportunity. Eisenhower gave the order, "We go." Immediately, the greatest invasion fleet ever assembled set sail. On board were over 130,000 young soldiers. Consider for a moment who these soldiers were. The average age of the American GIs was 21. Most had never seen combat or even been 50 miles from their hometown. As they sailed to the French shoreline, Eisenhower wrote a press release in case of catastrophe. D-Day was an all-or-nothing affair. A new invasion strategy would take months, if not years, to devise. The initial battle reports were seriously troubling. At Omaha Beach, overlooked by cliffs honeycombed with trenches, cannon and machine guns, the Americans took heavy losses. "I might have killed hundreds that morning," reflected German soldier Heinz Sevelow, manning one of the bunkers. The rough surf also took its toll.
Dr. Hal Baumgarten,
With the US Army's 116th Infantry remembered, some of the fellows were pulled under by their wet combat jackets and heavy equipment. We couldn't help, they just drowned. Further along, Army Rangers took heavy casualties as they scaled the cliffs under intense gunfire. However, by midday, with US naval support, the Germans, low on supplies and ammunition, began to fold. Nazi reinforcements, including hundreds of tanks, which might have made all the difference, were not ordered to Normandy until the afternoon. Before the Germans could mount an effective counterattack, the Allies had secured all 5 landing beaches. Churchill had expected 20,000 to be killed on D-Day. Fortunately, heavy though they were, the losses were much lower. Of the 156,000 Allied personnel who hit the beaches that day, 10,000 became casualties. Of these, 5,000 were killed. No one died in vain. Their sacrifice meant an end to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. Another year of bitter fighting lay ahead, but D-Day, June 6, 1944, was a pivotal step on the road to forever removing the Nazi tyranny from Europe and the world. I'm Peter Caddick-Adams, author of Sand and Steel, A New History of D-Day, for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video.
From the end of
To
World
help
War
keep
II,
PragerU
the United
video-
States and its Western European allies were involved in a nearly half-century-long titanic struggle with the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. It was cold only in the sense that the Russians and Americans never came to direct blows, but it was certainly not cold for the Cubans, Koreans, Vietnamese, and others who got caught up in the communists' relentless drive to destabilize the free, democratic, capitalist world. There were, to be sure, many morally complex moments during this long struggle. But the Cold War was, at its core, as clear a conflict of good versus evil as World War II had been. Just like that war, the Cold War was a death match between the forces representing freedom and the forces representing totalitarianism. Because hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, died in it, the Cold War can, with good reason, be described as the Third World War. The instigator of this war was Joseph Stalin, the mass-murdering dictator of Russia and of the many non-Russian peoples he had incorporated into what was known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union for short. Stalin knew that his Soviet armed forces could not take on the might of the Free West. Instead, he decided to wage this fight through the use of proxies, and by a massive use of disinformation and misinformation. His initial prey was Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia, as well as Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia. Stalin had troops in all these countries at the end of the war. Despite what he promised American President Franklin Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet leader had no intention of removing them, and gaining control over their governments proved to be quite easy. In March 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. When Stalin threatened both Greece and Turkey, President Harry Truman finally had enough. The so-called Truman Doctrine was born. The United States and its allies would not permit any further expansion of the communist empire. The Cold War was on. For the next 5 decades and across 4 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia and South America, the US and the Soviet Union battled for influence, sometimes overtly, like in Korea and Vietnam, and sometimes covertly through their various spy agencies. But the moral lines of this battle never changed. The freedom of the West versus the communist tyranny of the Soviet East. There are, nonetheless, as there were even at the time, those who argue that the Cold War was an overreaction by the West, that the ambitions and strength of the Soviet bloc were greatly exaggerated, and that America, with its massive defence build-up, was just as responsible for the Cold War as was the Soviet Union. But this simply isn't true, as an immense amount of archival evidence from Russia, not available until after the Cold War ended, now proves. Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, stated Soviet intentions plainly in 1956. "We will bury you," he told the West. Nor would any amount of negotiation, détente as it was called then, have led to a just conclusion of the war. The American diplomat George Kennan rightly warned that short of becoming a communist country, there was nothing the United States could do to gain the Kremlin's trust. The Soviets could not be appeased, only contained. But even containment was an inadequate strategy. Yes, the Soviet Union could not have beaten the US in a head-to-head confrontation, but it didn't have to. Victory in the Cold War would have allowed it, through intimidation and subversion, to dominate the globe, making communism, rather than democracy and capitalism, the preeminent ideology. There were many times during the 5 decades of the war that it seemed like this would be the case. But thanks primarily to the strong leadership shown by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but a whimper. The Soviet Union was, at the close of the 1980s, to use historian Paul Johnson's description, a bewildered giant. Economically bereft, militarily exhausted, no longer able or willing to enforce its will. Communism had failed in every possible way, economically, politically, morally. It had tried to create a utopia on Earth and instead created hell for all of the nations that came under its sway. Yes, the forces of liberty eventually won the Cold War, but this triumph offers little consolation to millions who died or suffered needlessly through no fault of their own for a never viable and now badly discredited cause. I'm Andrew Roberts for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help
Vietnam
keep
War lasted 10
videos
years,
free,
cost America 58,000 lives, and over $1 trillion adjusted for inflation. It brought down a president, stirred social unrest, and ended in defeat. No one in hindsight believes fighting a losing war is ever worth the cost. Consequently, the Vietnam War is usually written off as a colossal strategic blunder and a humanitarian disaster. Yet historical appraisals might have been much different had the Vietnam War followed the pattern of the Korean War, which the United States fought for almost identical reasons, the defense of freedom in Asia. The U.S. had military advisors in Vietnam during the 1950s, but didn't become involved in a major way until 1963. President John F. Kennedy firmly believed in the domino effect, the foreign policy theory that vulnerable nations without help would fall one after another, like dominoes, to external communist aggression. Kennedy thus hoped to stop Soviet and Chinese-backed communist invasions in the manner President Harry Truman had in Korea by taking a stand in Vietnam. As with Korea was a war the United States did not seek. As with Korea, Vietnam presented no imperial advantages, no natural resources, or resources of any kind that the United States needed to protect or wished to obtain. As with Korea, the aggressor was a communist government in the North intent on taking control of the South, and its military crossed an internationally recognized border to do so. Following Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, President Lyndon Johnson vastly escalated America's role in 1964. But even as he did so, Johnson prosecuted the war with deep ambivalence, authorizing significantly more troops and money for the war, but never pushing for total victory. In contrast, the North Vietnamese never wavered. They ignored every one of Johnson's many offers to negotiate a settlement. By 1971, the war was at a stalemate, neither side able to establish a clear advantage. The President, Richard Nixon, pursued a two-pronged strategy: to turn over combat operations to the South Vietnamese and to bomb North Vietnam. The effort brought the Communists to the Paris peace talks, and by 1973 the North agreed to a general settlement, establishing two autonomous Vietnamese nations, one communist, one non-communist, in the manner of North and South Korea. However, the Watergate scandal, the subsequent resignation of President Nixon, and the Democrats' sweeping congressional victory in the 1974 midterm election all helped to convince the North Vietnamese that America would not enforce the peace agreement. They were right. Without U.S. air support and material aid, the South Vietnamese had no chance against the North. Well supplied by the Soviet Union and the Chinese, the Communists gained full control over the country in April 1975. The war proved far more costly than Korea because the geography and landscapes of Vietnam were far more conducive to insurgency operations. There were also far more restrictions placed on American commanders than during the Korean War. And the United States in the 1960s was a far less conservative and cohesive country than America of the 1950s. Yet despite the long ordeal and terrible costs, South Vietnam was saved in 1973, only to be lost in 1975. The U.S. defeat in Vietnam was a political choice, not a military necessity. Had the U.S. protected an independent but vulnerable South Vietnam in 1973 and 4, that country would have most likely followed the model of South Korea. Millions of Southeast Asians would not have become boat people and refugees or have been sent to the gulags and re-education camps. A viable U.S.-backed democratic Vietnam would have stabilized the region and almost certainly prevented the neighboring Cambodian genocide, in which 1/5 of that country, 2 million people, were slaughtered by its communist leadership. And much of the bitterness over the war on both sides of the American political spectrum, still with us today, would have vanished. And for the communist Vietnamese, the instigators and aggressors of the terrible conflict, what was it all for? Today, ironically, the Vietnamese government aspires to nothing more than the capitalist affluence that it once reviled. I'm Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution for Prager University.
To keep our videos free,
the world is on
click
fire.
here.
The Middle East is being torn up by war and terrorism that have forced millions of people to flee. Syria looks like the disaster of a generation. Iran seeks to dominate the region and openly declares its intention to wipe a sovereign nation off the map, while in Eastern Europe, a resurgent Russia has seized Ukrainian territory by force of arms. China is flexing its muscles against its neighbors around the South China Sea. There is only one nation in the world capable of putting out these fires. That nation is, of course, the United States. Many Americans will argue, understandably, that this is not fair. It may not be fair, but it is a fact. Only America has the diplomatic reach, the financial resources, and the firepower to lead the free world against the autocrats, rogue states, and terrorists that are trying to overwhelm it. As the Prime Minister of Denmark from 2001 to 2009, and the Secretary General of NATO from 2009 to 2014, I know how important American leadership is. I've seen firsthand what happens when America tries to lead from behind instead of leading from the front. A case in point, Russia illegally annexed Crimea in March 2014, the first gunpoint land grab in Europe since the end of World War II. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry called it an unbelievable act of aggression. He went on, "You just don't, in the 21st century, behave in 19th century fashion by invading another country on a completely trumped-up pretext." This might be an admirable statement of principle, but as a guide to policy, it is dangerously naive, because whether it was believable or not, it happened. The first half of the 20th century was the bloodiest in human history. That was before America became a global superpower. Since America's ascendancy, the major world powers have coexisted in relative peace. Now that peace is threatened, and America must step forward again. Simply put, no one else can do it. Europe is too weak and divided to lead the world. The free nations have an essential role to play, and they must shoulder their full share at the cost. But only America has the credibility to lead. This is not just about money or manpower. It's also about morality. Only America has the moral greatness to lead the free world, not for the sake of power, but for the sake of peace. Yet the US will only be able to ensure peace if its leaders act with conviction. If the world even thinks that America lacks the will to use force or enforce its red lines, it leaves a vacuum that will be filled by corrupt autocrats, rogue states, and murderous terrorists. As tempting as retreat might be, it won't make America and the other freedom-loving countries safer or more prosperous. History shows us the bad guys don't stay in their own neighborhoods. We only need to look at Pearl Harbor or 9/11 to be reminded that the safety of Americans is deeply connected to the rest of the world. And the stability that has permitted the vast and worldwide economic expansion since World War II, an expansion that has lifted billions of people out of poverty, could not have happened if America had not guaranteed it. But freedom, stability, and prosperity don't come for free. And they are not the norm, they are the exception. An American retreat will unleash a new plague of dictators and oppressors who seek to undo all the good America has done to secure peace and prosperity around the world for decades. And that could lead to a fire no one will be able to put out. I'm Anders Fogh Rasmussen for Prager University.
The Iraq War was an absolute disaster, a historic mistake. That's probably what most Americans, not to mention most people around the world, would say. But is it true? President George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq in 2003 is subject to fair debate. But it's important to recall that at the time, the war had overwhelming bipartisan support in the House and Senate. Dozens of allied countries joined the coalition. That support, however, quickly faded as casualties mounted and the war started to bog down. Criticism then turned to blame, when the weapons of mass destruction that were expected to be found were not. Nothing seemed to be going right. I know. I was there, serving as a lieutenant in the United States Army. As 2007 dawned, President Bush faced a near total collapse in both public and political support for the war. He had to make an impossibly difficult decision: accept strategic defeat and leave Iraq in chaos, or send even more troops into battle. He chose the latter, a decision that came to be known as the surge. The Democrats predicted disaster. Senator Harry Reid, the majority leader at the time, said, "This war is lost, and the surge is not accomplishing anything." Senators Joe Biden, John Kerry, and Hillary Clinton agreed. They were all wrong. Led by General David Petraeus and supplemented by 30,000 additional troops, American forces and their Iraqi counterparts reversed the course of the war. It was one of the most stunning and successful turnabouts in modern military history. In 2008, I returned to the country to see for myself. I had seen the before. I could hardly believe the after. Attacks on U.S. forces were down 90%. American casualties were rare. Baghdad's most dangerous neighborhoods were secure. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was decimated. The oil was flowing again, Iraqis were rebuilding, and new elections were held. This was the Iraq that President Barack Obama inherited when he took the oath of office on January 20th, 2009. Now, Iraq was certainly no Western-style democracy, but it was, as General Petraeus dubbed it, a functioning Iraqracy. So much so that in a February 2009 speech to Marines at Camp Lejeune, President Obama said, "The relative peace and strong participation in January's provincial elections sent a powerful message to the world about how far Iraqis have come." Vice President Joe Biden was even more enthusiastic a year later when he said in February of 2010, "I am very optimistic about Iraq. I think it's going to be one of the greatest achievements of this administration." To put it mildly, it wasn't. So, what went wrong? It started when the Obama administration got into a dispute with the Iraqi government over something called a Status of Forces Agreement. The Iraqis said they wanted to be able to prosecute American soldiers who broke Iraqi law. Appropriately, the Obama administration said no. We will prosecute our own lawbreakers. But instead of continuing to work towards an agreement, the president, against the advice of his own generals, ended negotiations. President Obama had said during his campaign that he would bring all the troops home. And the status of forces dispute gave him the perfect excuse to do just that. On December 18, 2011, the last U.S. soldiers crossed the border into Kuwait. The United States military was out of Iraq. The Iraq War was over for America, but it was about to begin again for Iraqis. Islamist terror, which U.S. soldiers had successfully crushed, returned with a new vengeance, most prominently in the form of ISIS. And the fragile peace between Sunnis and Shia fell apart. With America nowhere to be seen, Iraq's neighbor to the east and America's mortal enemy, Iran, filled the political vacuum, while ISIS brutally exploited the security vacuum. Initially dismissed by President Obama as the JV team, ISIS took control of a large part of the country. Its black flag soon flew over Mosul, Fallujah, Ramadi, and many other cities that American troops had secured at great cost. The war that George W. Bush had won, Barack Obama had lost. The painful lesson is this: resolve works, and retreat doesn't. When America commits to military victory, as it did during the surge, it can defeat its enemies. But when America retreats, for political reasons, it loses. And so do millions of others. I'm Pete Hegseth for Prager University.
Decades back, in late 1972, South Vietnam and the United States were winning the Vietnam War decisively by every conceivable measure. That's not just my view. That was the view of our enemy, the North Vietnamese government officials. Victory was apparent when President Nixon ordered the U.S. Air Force to bomb industrial and military targets in Hanoi, North Vietnam's capital city, and in Haiphong, its major port city. And we would stop the bombing if the North Vietnamese would attend the Paris peace talks that they had left earlier. The North Vietnamese did go back to the Paris peace talks, and we did stop the bombing, as promised. On January the 23rd of 1973, President Nixon gave a speech to the nation on primetime television, announcing that the Paris Peace Accords had been initialed by the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and the accords would be signed on the 27th. What the United States and South Vietnam received in those accords was victory. At the White House, it was called VV Day, Victory in Vietnam Day. The U.S. backed up that victory with a simple pledge within the Paris Peace Accords, saying should the South require any military hardware to defend itself against any North Vietnam aggression, we would provide replacement aid to the South on a piece-by-piece, one-to-one replacement, meaning a bullet for a bullet, a helicopter for a helicopter. For all things lost, replacement. The advance of communist tyranny had been halted by those accords. Then it all came apart, and it happened this way. In August of the following year, 1974, President Nixon resigned his office as a result of what became known as Watergate. 3 months after his resignation came the November congressional elections, and within them the Democrats won a landslide victory for the new Congress. And many of the members used their new majority to defund the military aid that the United States had promised, peace for peace, breaking the commitment that we made to the South Vietnamese in Paris to provide whatever military hardware the South Vietnamese needed in case of aggression from the North. Put simply and accurately, a majority of Democrats of the 94th Congress did not keep the word of the United States. On April the 10th of 1975, President Gerald Ford appealed directly to those members of the Congress in an evening joint session televised to the nation. In that speech, he literally begged the Congress to keep the word of the United States. But as President Ford delivered his speech, many of the members of the Congress walked out of the chamber. Many of them had an investment in America's failure in Vietnam. They had participated in demonstrations against the war for many years, and they wouldn't give the aid. On April the 30th, South Vietnam surrendered, and re-education camps were constructed, and the phenomenon of the boat people began. If the South Vietnamese had received the arms that the United States promised, would the result have been different? It already had been different. The North Vietnamese leaders admitted that they were testing the new president, Gerald Ford, and they took one village after another, then cities, then provinces, and our only response was to go back on our word. The U.S. did not resupply the South Vietnamese as we had promised. It was then that the North Vietnamese knew they were on the road to South Vietnam's capital city, Saigon, that would soon be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Former Arkansas Senator William Fulbright, who had been the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, made a public statement about the surrender of South Vietnam. He said this, "I am no more distressed than I would be about Arkansas losing a football game to Texas." The U.S. knew that North Vietnam would violate the accords, and so we planned for it. What we did not know was that our own Congress would violate the accords, and violate them, of all things, on behalf of the North Vietnamese. That's what happened. I'm Bruce Hershenson.
Mention the Korean War today, and most people will look at you with a blank stare. At the time it was fought, just 5 years after World War II ended, everyone recognized it as a world-shaping conflict, a stark confrontation between the forces of democracy and communism. It began on June 25, 1950, when Soviet-backed Communist North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and invaded its U.S.-backed anti-communist South Korean neighbor. Within weeks, the communists had nearly absorbed the entire country. The United States at first was confused over whether it should or even could respond. America had slashed its military budget after the end of World War II and was short both men and equipment. It still had not awakened fully to the expansionist threat of Soviet Russia. The Soviets, buoyed by their own recent development of an atomic bomb and Mao Zedong's communist victory in China, sensed America's lack of resolve and encouraged the North's aggression. Yet within weeks, President Harry Truman rushed troops to save the shrinking Allied perimeter at Pusan on the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. By late September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur had successfully completed the Incheon landings and launched counterattacks. He quickly reclaimed the entire South and sent American-led United Nations forces far into North Korea to reunite the entire peninsula, only to be surprised when hundreds of thousands of Chinese Red Army troops crossed the Yalu River at the Chinese border and sent the outnumbered Americans reeling back into South Korea. Thanks to the genius of General Matthew Ridgway, who arrived to assume supreme command in South Korea in December 1950, over the next 100 days, U.S.-led UN forces pushed the communists back across the 38th parallel. The fighting was fierce. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, exchanged hands between communist and U.S.-led forces 5 times before it was finally secured. During the years 1952 and 1953, the war grew static, neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Eventually, the conflict ended with a tense armistice in July 1953. For over the next 60 years, a Cold War persisted between the Stalinist North and what by the 1980s had evolved into the democratic economic powerhouse of South Korea. Over 35,000 Americans died in the Korean War. The war marked the first major armed conflict of the nuclear age, and one in which the United States had not clearly defeated the enemy and thus not dictated terms of surrender. Was fighting the Korean War and restoring the South without uniting the entire peninsula worth the huge cost in blood and treasure? The natural dividend of saving the South was the evolution of today's democratic and prosperous South Korea that has given its 50 million citizens undreamed of freedom and affluence, and has blessed the world with top-flight products from the likes of Hyundai, Kia, LG, and Samsung. South Korea is a model global citizen and a strong ally of the U.S., and stands in sharp contrast to the communist regime in the North that has starved and murdered millions of its own people and caused untold mischief in the world community. Had it not been for U.S. intervention and support to the South, the current monstrous regime in Pyongyang would now rule all of Korea, ensuring its nuclear-armed dictatorship even greater power and resources. The American effort to save South Korea also sent a message to both Communist China and the Soviet Union that the free world, under U.S. leadership, would no longer tolerate communist military takeovers of free nations. The resulting deterrence policy helped to keep the communist world from attempting similar surprise attacks on Japan, Taiwan, and Western Europe. Finally, the Korean War awakened the United States to the dangers of disarmament and isolationism, and led to the bipartisan foreign policy of containment of global communism that in 1989 finally led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it victory in the Cold War. The Korean War was an incomplete American victory in its failure to liberate North Korea and unite the peninsula, but a victory nonetheless, and not just from a military perspective, but from a moral one as well. The reason 35,000 Americans died in Korea was to keep at least half the Korean people free. Korea did not have a single material resource that would have benefited America. The Korean War merits more than a blank stare. It deserves to be remembered and studied with pride. I'm Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution for Prager University.
As an historian, I'm often asked if I could stop one event in modern history from happening, what would it be? My answer is World War I. If there had been no World War I, there would have been no Russian Revolution, no World War II, no Holocaust, no Cold War. And that doesn't even consider the millions who died in the war itself. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Europe experienced an unprecedented period of economic growth. Brought about by the Industrial Revolution, this new prosperity spawned rapid developments in science, medicine, art, and political philosophy. The future of civilization never looked brighter. And then suddenly, it all went up in flames. The fuse was lit in June 1914 in a street in Sarajevo, Bosnia. It was there that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. It should have been no more than a sad footnote in history. Instead, it changed history. Austria-Hungary, seeking to avenge the Archduke's murder, declared war on Serbia. But before taking this drastic step, it asked for and received a blessing from its powerful ally, Germany. Serbia, knowing that it had no chance against Austria-Hungary, called on its ally, Russia, to defend it. Russia agreed. To strengthen its hand, Russia solicited French support should war break out. France, ever suspicious of German intentions, assented. Germany then made a preemptive move to take France out of the war. The German command, having long planned this war, invaded France through neutral Belgium. This prompted Britain to join France against Germany. Suddenly, the entire continent was engulfed in war. The key player was Germany. Their strategy was to punch through Belgium and France and capture Paris before the French had time to react. This was the so-called Schlieffen Plan, named after the German general who conceived it. With France conquered, they would turn their attention to Russia. That Germany thought it would actually work comes down to one man, Germany's leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Emperor of Germany from 1888 until his forced abdication in 1918, Wilhelm was a profoundly unpleasant, unstable, and vicious personality. By 1914, he believed that Germany should not only dominate Europe, but the entire world. Had the Schlieffen Plan worked, Germany most certainly would have. But it didn't work. The British and the French put up stiff resistance in the West. Russia did the same in the East. The losses incurred by all sides were immediate and appalling. The widespread use, for the first time, of barbed wire, machine guns, tanks, and worst of all, poison gas, turned the fields of France and the steppes of Russia into vast cemeteries. By 1917, the war was at a stalemate. Who knows how long it would have stayed that way if the United States had not been drawn in. Ironically, President Woodrow Wilson had been elected largely because he promised to keep America out of Europe's war. His attitude changed when Germany attacked American merchant ships in the Atlantic. The final straw was the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany promised to give Mexico, in exchange for its military support, much of the American Southwest, including Texas. The infusion of American manpower and weaponry allowed the Allies to take the initiative. The war finally ended in November of 1918. 16 million people, soldiers and civilians, were dead. 3 million Russians, 2.5 million Germans, 1.7 million French, 1 million British, and 117,000 Americans. Russia was now in the hands of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. France and Britain were physically and morally shattered. Germany, forced into a humiliating surrender treaty at Versailles, would soon be further decimated by runaway inflation that destroyed what was left of its economy. Meanwhile, the United States retreated into isolationism. It was a pause, not a peace. The stage was being set for a new and very much worse disaster, a Second World War, one that would lead to 3 times the deaths of the first one. It would be instigated by a madman who fought for the Kaiser and shared the same dream of world domination. Had it not been for World War I, we would never have heard of him. I'm Andrew Roberts for Prager University.
President Harry S. Truman's decision to use atomic weapons against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved to be one of the most controversial decisions in American history. As the years have passed, the controversy has only intensified. More and more people, both in America and abroad, have condemned both President Truman and America for that decision. But this criticism is based on limited historical knowledge of both the situation Truman confronted and the basis for his decision. Such flawed analysis has been aided by the unfortunate influence of some very bad history, such as that written by members of the so-called atomic diplomacy school. These historians disgracefully alleged that Truman proceeded to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, which he knew was on the verge of surrender, so as to intimidate the Soviet Union in the already developing Cold War. That specious interpretation must be refuted fully. Truman sought to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 major military-industrial targets, to avoid an invasion of Japan, which Truman knew would mean, in his words, quote, an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other, end quote. His assumptions were entirely legitimate. By July of 1945, the Japanese had been subjected to months of devastating attacks by American B-29s. Their capital and other major cities had suffered extensive damage, and the home islands were subjected to a naval blockade that made food and fuel increasingly scarce. Japanese military and civilian losses had reached approximately 3 million, and there seemed no end in sight. Despite all this, however, Japan's leaders, and especially its military, clung fiercely to notions of getsu-go, decisive battle. In fact, the Japanese government had mobilized a large part of the population into a national militia which would be deployed to defend the home islands. Confirming the Japanese determination to fight on is the fact that even after the use of the atomic bombs against both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese military still wanted to pursue that desperate option. The atomic bombs forced Emperor Hirohito to understand clearly, and in a way his military leaders refused to comprehend, that the defense of the homeland was hopeless. It took the unprecedented intervention of a Japanese emperor to break the impasse in the Japanese government and finally order surrender. It was only the dropping of the atom bombs that allowed the emperor and the so-called peace faction in the Japanese government to negotiate an end to the war. All the viable alternate scenarios to secure American victory all would have meant significantly greater American and Allied casualties and much higher Japanese civilian and military casualties. According to American military estimates at the time, those numbers would have been well above 1 million. Hard as it may be to accept, Japanese losses would have been far greater without the bombs. And the overall casualties would also have included thousands of Allied prisoners of war whom the Japanese planned to execute in case of invasion. Truman's use of the bomb should be seen as his choosing the least awful of the options available to him. Even in retrospect, far removed from the pressures that Truman faced in 1945, his critics can offer no serious and convincing proposal regarding a viable and less costly alternative. The judgment of history is clear and unambiguous. The atomic bombs shortened the war, averted the need for a land invasion, saved countless more lives on both sides of the blood-soaked conflict than they cost, and ended the Japanese brutalization of the conquered peoples of Asia. Given the alternatives, what would any moral person have done in Truman's position? I'm Father Wilson Miscamble, Professor of History at Notre Dame for Prager University.
The United States had to fight not one, but 2 wars for its independence. The first, of course, was the Revolutionary War. Can you name the second? It was the War of 1812. Now, both wars were against the British. And in both cases, the Americans should have lost. The Revolutionary War is very much celebrated in American history. The second one has all but been forgotten. But had it been lost, America's history would have been much, much different. The British precipitated the war by failing to recognize the United States as a sovereign nation. For 5 years between 1807 and 1812, they repeatedly disrupted American commerce, boarding American merchant ships, capturing their sailors, over 5,000 of them, and forcing them to work on British ships. Finally, President James Madison said, "Enough." And on June 18, 1812, Congress declared war on Britain. The euphoria didn't last long, and for good reason. The Americans had no viable strategy, no standing army to speak of, no generals worthy of the rank, a very small navy, a wholly inadequate supply of munitions. It was a different story on the British side. They had all the men, ships, generals, and admirals they needed, and then some. If these upstart Yankees wanted war, the British were only too happy to accommodate them. Things went pretty much as expected, one American defeat after another, culminating in the burning of Washington, D.C. The great prize of the war was not the tiny American capital or even the larger nearby city of Baltimore. The prize the British wanted was a gateway to the American West, the city at the mouth of the Mississippi River, New Orleans. If Britain controlled this key southern port, it could check American expansion, confining it to the eastern half of the continent for the foreseeable future. To take New Orleans, the British amassed an enormous sea and land force, 60 ships, 10,000 men. And what could the Americans offer by way of defense? Enter Andrew Jackson, one of the most remarkable figures in American history. Born in 1767 in the territories of the Carolinas, Jackson first encountered the British during the Revolutionary War. His memories were not happy ones. His mother and his two brothers died in the war, and Jackson himself was left with a permanent scar, the gift of a British officer who slashed him with his sword when the teenage boy refused to clean his boots. Self-educated, Jackson settled in Nashville, Tennessee. There he became a frontier lawyer and, after Tennessee was admitted to the Union, served briefly as its sole congressman, then as a senator representing the new state. Though he had no formal military training, Jackson was elected Major General of the Tennessee Militia and gained fighting experience leading several successful campaigns against the Indians of the region. He inspired both great loyalty and great fear in the men under his command. Loyalty because he fought beside them, enduring every hardship they endured, and fear because he demanded strict military discipline. Given the inherently rebellious, don't tread on me nature of the frontiersmen under his command, this was no mean feat. But Jackson had never faced a foe like the British, a highly disciplined, battle-tested army. On his side of the ledger, the American general had a motley assortment of volunteers, militiamen, free men of color, Indians, and regulars, joined by legendary New Orleans pirate Jean Lafitte and his pirate band. The American force was still less than half of what the British had in numbers and far less in combat experience. But for all their deficiencies, Jackson's men had three talents he fully exploited. They knew the terrain, they knew how to dig, and they knew how to shoot. The Battle of New Orleans began in earnest at dawn, January 8th, 1815. The overconfident British had no idea what they were in for. Wading through the mud of Louisiana swamps and thwarted by Jackson's hastily constructed but formidable ramparts, one British charge after another was cut down by deadly accurate American artillery and rifle fire. When it was over, it amounted to the worst defeat in British military history. No two accounts of the battle would agree on the exact casualty count, but all agreed it was stunningly high. According to one British infantry captain, 3 generals, 7 colonels, 75 officers, a total of 1,781 officers and soldiers had fallen in a few minutes. The American losses amounted to no more than a dozen dead. The War of 1812, America's second war of independence, began badly and only got worse, but it ended with one of the greatest victories in American military history. It made Jackson a national hero and set up a successful run for the presidency 13 years later. Even more, it guaranteed the Western expansion of the United States would proceed without interruption. I'm Brian Kilmeade for Prager University.
Should America be the world's policeman? Whenever this question is asked, and it has been asked for nearly 100 years, the answer is usually no. Progressives will say that it suggests American arrogance. Who made America the boss of the world? Many conservatives, especially those with libertarian leanings, will answer that what other countries do to their neighbors or even to their own people is of no concern of ours. But here's the question that is almost never asked. What's the alternative? Well, one answer is the United Nations. That's why the UN was formed after the Second World War, to maintain order and protect human rights. And that's why there are UN peacekeepers around the world. But their record at keeping the peace is abysmal. To cite just one example, at least 500,000 people were slaughtered in Rwanda in 1994, while UN peacekeepers stood by. Furthermore, the United Nations' nearly 200 members seldom agree on anything. And when they do marshal a peacekeeping force, its numbers are always small, they are poorly armed and highly restricted in their use of the few weapons they do possess. They are much more likely to step aside when faced with aggression than to actively oppose it. What about dividing the world into spheres of influence? Is that really a good idea? Do we want a world where Russia gets to do what it wants toward democratic neighbors such as Latvia, and Iran dominates its region, and so on? Would such a world lead to peace or to ever more violent competition over the borders of those spheres? And of course, there's an idea that if America leaves the world alone, the world will leave America alone. If only. The Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky once said that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Great powers don't get to take a vacation and don't get to take themselves off the terrorist target list. So, we quickly come to an inescapable conclusion. The United States is the world's policeman because there is no alternative, and everybody knows it. But what if Americans don't want the job anymore? What if the cop walked off the beat? The answer is clear and well-grounded both in history and current events. When America retreats, the bad guys advance. It's not a coincidence that after the US pulled its troops out of Iraq, Islamic State exploded onto the world stage. And while it's easy to criticize America for its perceived failures in Vietnam and the first few years in Iraq, what about its obvious successes? After the Second World War ended in 1945, the Soviet Union sought to dominate the world. It failed for one reason. The United States stopped it. In 1991, we stopped Saddam Hussein and kicked him out of Kuwait. Later, we intervened to save the Balkans. As I write in my book, America in Retreat, the order the U.S. has provided has not only had enormous security benefits for all the world, it has produced phenomenal economic advantages. Global GDP, just $11 trillion in 1980, doubled by the time the Cold War ended a decade later. By 2012, it reached $72 trillion. The debate over the value of an American supervised peace, Pax Americana, should have been settled long ago. But history only settles great debates for as long as people remember the history. Many college students today could barely identify the Soviet Union, let alone explain how its plans to impose communism on nation after nation were defeated. Americans have lived in a relatively orderly world for so long that many have become complacent about maintaining it. Perhaps that explains why, in recent years, the United States has adopted a foreign policy that neglects to do the things that have made that orderly world possible. Commitments to global security, military forces adequate to meet those commitments, a willingness to intervene in regional crises to protect allies and to confront or deter aggressive regimes. If the world's leading liberal democratic nation doesn't assume its role as world policeman, the world's rogues will try to fill the breach. Then the world would be very much like it was in the 1930s, when Western self-doubt, war weariness, economic turmoil, American self-involvement, and the rise of ambitious dictatorships combined to produce unprecedented death and mayhem. Not everyone grows up wanting to be a cop, but no one wants to live in a neighborhood or a world where there is no cop. Would you? I'm Brett Stevens.
Everybody knows what happened on 9/11, right? The truth is most of my peers, I was born after 2001, don't. They almost certainly don't know why it happened. Most probably don't even know who did it. Such things aren't taught in schools now. So here's what took place on that fateful Tuesday, what the United States of America did about it, and why it's one of the most important days in American history. September 11, 2001 began as a beautiful morning on the East Coast. America was at peace, not embroiled in any foreign war. Passengers boarded their early flights, headed to business meetings, or to visit relatives across the country. Tragically, they were not the only ones who boarded planes that morning. 19 Islamic terrorists, organized by the terrorist group that calls itself Al-Qaeda, directed by its leader Osama bin Laden and drawn from 4 Arab countries, also boarded planes that morning. All of the planes, the terrorists were split among 4 of them, were cross-country flights. Their tanks were filled to capacity with jet fuel. Within an hour after takeoff, these 19 terrorists would hijack the planes, brutally murder defenseless stewardesses and pilots, and kill 3,000 innocent people. At 8:46 a.m., a hijacked American Airlines flight leaving Boston crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, the international symbol of America's economic power. 17 minutes later, a second hijacked plane, also departing from Boston, crashed into the World Trade Center's South Tower. The two planes, spewing their jet fuel, ignited fires that burned hot enough to compromise the building's structural integrity. Hundreds of New York firefighters and police officers raced up the towers to rescue the victims. Quite suddenly, the buildings collapsed, killing 343 firefighters, 60 police officers, and thousands of trapped office workers. A third hijacked plane, leaving Washington's Dulles Airport, crashed into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. military. 125 Pentagon workers were killed. The passengers of a fourth hijacked plane, this one leaving Newark International Airport shortly after the others, had just enough time to learn, via their cell phones, of the other attacks. Those on board decided that the nightmare would stop with them. Unarmed, with no hope of survival, they fought the terrorists, crashing the plane in an empty field in Pennsylvania. They gave their lives so that more Americans would not die. We learned later that this plane, United Airlines Flight 93, had been heading for either the White House or U.S. Capitol. The Islamic terrorists who launched these attacks made a number of claims about their motivations. But here's the truth. They did not murder thousands of Americans because they disagreed with America's Middle East policy. And they certainly didn't do it because they were poor and hopeless. They were all either from wealthy or middle-class Arab families. They attacked America because they despised its values, most especially its freedom and tolerance. The United States, as the guardian of freedom in the West, had to be brought down. This attack would start that process. It would show the world that America was weak, that America lacked the will to safeguard its liberties and people. Bin Laden called America a paper tiger. In the days immediately after the attacks, the terrorist leader and his many supporters in the Muslim Middle East believed he had proved his point. Mothers across the Muslim world named their babies Osama. Bin Laden's face adorned posters in homes, and kids in Pakistan wore Bin Laden t-shirts. But on the afternoon of September 14th, President George W. Bush visited the twisted, still smoldering wreckage of Ground Zero, where the Twin Towers had stood, and megaphone in hand, promised that America would not be cowed. "I can hear you," he said. "The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear from all of us soon." And they did. America launched its war on terror, destroyed the terrorist leadership, and sent Bin Laden into a decade of running and hiding. Within 6 months, kids in Pakistan were no longer wearing Bin Laden t-shirts. And 10 years later, the CIA located and a team of Navy SEALs killed the terrorist leader. America will always have her enemies. There will always be those who despise our freedoms, who hate our democracy, who want to see America buckle in the face of tyranny, to sacrifice our way of life to appease those who despise it. And we will always be faced with a choice: to surrender our freedoms or to preserve them, to grovel before those who hate us, or to honor the lives of the nearly 3,000 Americans who died on 9/11. But first, young Americans need to learn what happened that day. I'm C.J. Pearson for Prager University.
Why did the United States go to war against Iraq in 2003? The decision was controversial at the time and remains so today, but the reason was clear. Saddam Hussein, the brutal dictator of Iraq for 35 years, was the central threat to peace in the Middle East. With that threat removed, the Bush administration believed the establishment of a functioning democracy in Iraq would encourage the growth of democracy elsewhere in the Arab world. As democracy spread, terrorism would retreat. But it is on the blood-stained life and career of Saddam Hussein that we need to concentrate in order better to understand why the United States felt forced to act in 2003. We begin with the Iran-Iraq War, which Saddam started in 1980 and which lasted until 1988. 1 million people died in the course of the decade-long struggle. And during that war, weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, especially poison gas, were used on a regular basis by both sides. Once his war with Iran ended, instead of building up his shattered nation, Saddam decided to embark on another lunatic adventure. In 1990, he tried to grab 19% of the world's oil supply by invading Kuwait. His brief annexation of Kuwait proved to be another disaster. The mother of all battles, as Saddam called it, turned out to be a 3-week rout, his Iraqi army utterly defeated by a US-led coalition. But rather than trying Saddam as a war criminal, America and the West allowed him to stay in power. This appeasement eventually led Saddam, once again, to draw entirely the wrong conclusion and to his making yet another colossal mistake. He arrogantly believed that his Iraqi army might actually defeat the United States in a second encounter. His trump card, he believed, or at least attempted to make the world believe, was his possession of WMD, large quantities of poison gas and, if only in his imagination, a rapidly progressing nuclear weapons development program. There was no reason to doubt that he had WMD, as he'd used poison gas in his war against Iran. No one, not the Germans, not the Russians, not the British, had any doubts about this. Looking back at the 12 years between the Gulf War and the Iraq War, Saddam might have been able to re-establish international credibility by complying with the 16 reasonable UN resolutions passed between November 1990 and December 1999. These resolutions simply required Saddam to, among other things, destroy all of his ballistic missiles with a range greater than 150 kilometers, stop support for terrorism internationally and prevent terrorist organizations from operating within Iraq, and bear financial liability for damage from the Gulf War. But Saddam spent the 1990s defying and mocking America and Britain in every possible way. He attempted to shoot down Royal Air Force and US Air Force planes over the no-fly zones created to prevent him from mass slaughtering his own citizens. He corruptly profited from the UN oil for food scandal, while Iraqi children starved to death. He offered $25,000 to the families of every Palestinian suicide bomber. He harboured many of the world's leading terrorists, and he expelled UN weapons inspectors. By the time of the terrorist attack on the United States of 9/11, something for which Saddam was not responsible for or ever blamed for, any war against terror that did not involve toppling this brutal dictator, who might supply WMD to terrorists for future attacks, would have been absurd. Still, had he backed down and accepted repeated United Nations resolutions, especially those requiring him to prove he had destroyed his stockpiles of WMD and had no nuclear weapons development program, there would have been no US action. Instead, he only became more bellicose. That's why some leading Democrats, such as Senators Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden and John Kerry, voted to authorize the Second Iraq War. Only later did they recant their decisions after claiming that they'd been lied to by the administration. But there had been no need for the Bush administration to lie. Its assessment of the threat that Saddam posed concurred with that of the Clinton administration, as well as with numerous European intelligence services. And the road to a democratic Middle East had to begin in Iraq. A vicious, mass-murdering despot who had convinced the world that he had WMD and would use them stood in the way. In the spring of 2003, that was obvious both to Republicans and many Democrats, as well as to the leadership of Britain and dozens of other nations. That's why President Bush took America to war against Iraq. I'm Andrew Roberts for Prager University.
Would a government-run, Canadian-style healthcare system work in the United States, a nation of 320 million people? Well, we already know the answer. Just ask America's veterans. They've had government-run healthcare for decades. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, known as the VA, runs the largest hospital and healthcare system in America. The VA employs over 340,000 people, twice the size of the Marine Corps. And it has a $180 billion annual budget, making it the second largest department in the federal government. Only the Department of Defense budget is bigger. The VA is a true single-payer healthcare system. It runs over 150 hospitals and 1,400 community-based clinics across all 50 states. The doctors, nurses, administrators, everyone that works for the VA is a government employee. The system actively serves some 7 million patients, 1/3 of the 21 million veterans alive in the U.S. today. Sounds impressive, right? But for the past few decades, and especially for veterans of the war in Vietnam, as well as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan where I served, the VA has been an abysmal failure. Inefficient, bureaucratic, and sometimes deadly. Among veterans, horror stories about the VA abound. These stories were tragically brought to light in 2014, when whistleblowers in Phoenix revealed that 1,700 veterans there had waited an average of 115 days just to receive an initial appointment. According to the VA's official policy, that wait time should have been no more than 14 days. As if that wasn't bad enough, the Phoenix VA then lied about it, releasing falsified wait lists to the public to cover its tracks. Phoenix turned out to be the norm, not the exception. The VA's Inspector General found systemic problems across the country. In Fort Collins, Colorado, for example, clerks were instructed to falsify records to show that doctors were seeing more patients than they actually were. In Columbia, South Carolina, delays in diagnosis and treatment directly led to the deaths of multiple patients. The VA program there had nearly 4,000 backlogged appointments, despite a $1 million grant earmarked to reduce delays. And in the VA's hospital in Pittsburgh in 2011 and 2012, there was an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease that officials knew about for more than a year before informing patients. At least 6 veterans died as a result. The Obama administration's own Deputy Chief of Staff, Rob Neighbors, revealed that VA healthcare has a corrosive culture with significant and systemic failures. The politicians' response to this debacle? Spend more money, a lot more money. The VA's budget has almost doubled since 2009. They've hired 100,000 new people in the past decade. Wait times have actually gone up, yet not one administrator was fired for the waitlist scandal. The real solution to the problem is not more government, more money, and more bureaucracy. It's more competition, accountability, and transparency. Let the money follow the veteran. If veterans were given vouchers that they could use at any healthcare provider, private or government, they would control their own care. This, in turn, would force the VA to compete for their business, encouraging staff to treat patients as customers, not just as names on a waiting list. Until then, veterans will remain at the mercy of politicians and bureaucrats who continue to insist that the government can deliver quality and timely health care despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The reality is that it can't. This probably best explains why 2/3 of all veterans, 14 million people, don't use the VA at all. And those who do use the VA still get 75% of their health care outside of the VA system, even though they have to pay more for it. In short, whoever can afford not to use the VA doesn't use the VA. Hardly a ringing endorsement of the system. So, could government-run Canadian-style healthcare work in the United States? Given America's experience with the government-run single-payer VA, why would we even want to try? I'm Pete Hegseth for Prager University.
I am the fallen soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine. Remember me. I am the one that held the line. Sometimes I volunteered. Sometimes I went because I was told to go. But when the nation called, I answered. In order to serve, I left behind the family, friends, and freedom that so many take for granted. Over time, I used different weapons: a sword, a musket, a bayonet, a rifle, a machine gun. Often, I marched into battle on foot. Other times, I rode to battle on horseback or in wagons, sometimes on trains. Later, in tanks or jeeps or Humvees. In early wars, my ships were made of wood and powered by the wind. Later, they were made of steel and powered by diesel fuel or the atom. I even took to the air and mastered the sky in planes, helicopters, and jets. The machines of war evolved and changed with the times. But remember that it was always me, the warrior, that had to fight our nation's enemies. I fought at Lexington and Concord as our nation was born. I crossed the Delaware on Christmas Day in 1776. In the Civil War, I fought with my brothers and against my brothers at Gettysburg and Shiloh and Bull Run. I learned that we must never again divide. In World War I marched on the Marne and held the line at Belleau Wood. The war to end all wars, they called it. I just called it hell. In World War II, I fought everywhere. The beaches of Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, the hell of Guadalcanal. I stood against tyranny and kept darkness from consuming the world. In Korea, I landed at Incheon and broke out of the Chosin Reservoir. They called it the Forgotten War, but I never forgot. In Vietnam, I fought in the Mekong Delta, at Khe Sanh and Hamburger Hill. Some say my country wavered, but I did not waver. Ever. In the recent past, I have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Baghdad, Fallujah, and Ramadi, in Kunar, Helmand, and Kandahar. As technology advanced, I used night vision goggles and global positioning systems and drones and lasers and thermal optics. But it was still me, a human being, that did the work. It was me that patrolled up the mountains or across the desert or through the streets. It was me that suffered in merciless heat and bitter cold. It was me that went out night after night to confront our nation's enemies and confront evil face to face. It was me. Remember me. I was a warrior. But also remember that I was not only a warrior. Remember also that I was a son, a brother, a father. I was a daughter, a sister, a mother. I was a person, like you, a real person with hopes and dreams for the future. I wanted to have children. I wanted to see my son score a touchdown or shoot the winning basket. I wanted to walk my daughter down the aisle. I wanted to kiss my wife again. When I told her I would be with her until the end, I meant it. When I told my children I would always be there for them, I meant it. But I gave all that away. All of it. On that distant battlefield, amongst the fear and the fire and the bullets, or in the sky above enemy territory filled with flak, or on the unforgiving sea where we fought against the enemy and against the depths of the abyss. There, in those awful places, I held the line. I did not waver, and I did not hesitate. I, the soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine, I stood my ground and sacrificed my life, my future, my hopes, my dreams. I sacrificed everything for you. This Memorial Day, remember me, the fallen warrior, and remember me not for my sake, but for yours. Remember what I sacrificed so you can truly appreciate the incredible treasures you have. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. You have the joys of life, the joys that I gave up so that you can relish in them. A cool wind in the air, the gentle spring grass on your bare feet, the warm summer sun on your face, family, friends, and freedom. Never forget where it all came from. It came from sacrifice, the supreme sacrifice. Live a life that honors us, the fallen heroes. Remember us and make every day Memorial Day.